So the last clip we've got to watch today is another GB News one. And not only is it another GB News one, it's also another one involving Patrick Christie. So I do apologise for inflicting him upon you even more. What's even worse, right, is I'm not just going to inflict Patrick Christie's on you. I'm going to be inflicting Johnathan Gullis on you. Now this is a clip of him saying that he'd love Nigel Farage to be Tory leader. This tells you just how close Nigel Farage is to the Conservative base. Let's see what he has to say.
Rishi Sunak adds his lowest satisfaction rating to date. He's refused to rule out the possibility of Nigel Farage joining the Tory party when he comes out of the jungle. This comes after political stalwart Stanley Johnson insisted that the former UKIP leader could help turn around the party's flagging fortunes. So with Nigel's I'm a Celeb stint continuing for another day at least, I caught up with the Tory MP Johnathan Gullis earlier and asked if GB News' very own Brexit broker could be the man to save the future of the Conservative Party.
I mean, I find it difficult that Rishi Sunak would let Nigel Farage in. I can't imagine that Nigel Farage would want to join under Rishi Sunak, seeing that Nigel Farage thinks that Jeremy Hunt's economic policies are basically social democracy, right, despite it being neoliberal. And he thinks that Rishi Sunak is the one who is a Brexit betrayer because of the Windsor framework, right? All the whole ERG types, all of the Reform UK types are absolutely seething at the idea that Northern Ireland would be cut off from the rest of the Union. Like, that wouldn't be properly delivering Brexit. It's the same reason why the DUP are failing to actually get us to a point where Stormont sits. For the exact same reasons is this pro-Brexit position, right? There's no way that Farage would want to join under Rishi Sunak, given that he hates him on economic policy and he hates him on Brexit policy. He probably even hates him on some other aspect of social policy. And Rishi Sunak is the poster child for failed immigration policy, which is another one of Nigel Farage's big criticisms of the Conservative Party. So if Nigel Farage is going to join, Sunak would have to go.
Lots to talk about Nigel Farage joining the Conservative Party. Do you think he should?
I'd love to see it, Patrick, personally. I think Nigel has an awful lot to offer.
Why is GB News broadcasting a Zoom meeting? Is this 2020 all over again?
For number one, he is a big voice on the key issues like immigration that we know are a huge number one, and if not number two issue for Conservative voters, particularly those in 2019, and particularly those in the red wall like Stoke-on-Trent kids who and talk that I'm proud to serve. Secondly, I think he's actually an asset across the blue wall and the red wall. In essence, he's able to communicate in a way that many politicians aren't able to. Probably no one closer to having the ability other than Boris Johnson to be able to get a message across clearly and concisely. So
I think it's probably true that he does have a lot of Boris Johnson style appeal, but unless he backs that up with Boris Johnson style policies, he won't have the same effect in terms of actual people voting for the Tories in places like the Red Wall, like Boris Johnson did, because Boris Johnson promised interventionist economic policy that Nigel Farage literally doesn't agree with. He's like an arch-libertarian type. He wants the bonfire of regulations, Singapore style. He doesn't want like interventionist investment from the state, from the public sector. He describes that stuff as actual socialism. Right? He doesn't really actually like a lot of what Boris Johnson supported. He doesn't want levelling up. He doesn't want investment in hospitals. He wants privatisation. That's what he really wants in terms of economic policy. And he doesn't like the kind of Northern Ireland Protocol style stuff that Boris Johnson won an election off the back of. So Nigel Farage isn't close to Boris Johnson in policy, even though rhetorically he's similar to Boris Johnson, and the kind of people who support Boris Johnson also support him as well. I will also say, look, he's not going to have the support in the blue wall. In fact, it's the Tories' drift towards Nigel Farage's kind of politics that has lost Tory votes in the blue wall to the Liberal Democrats for being a little less kind of demonic in terms of policy and just looking like neoliberal people who will increase your house price. That's what the blue wall wants to see, and that's why Lib Dems have been winning all of the blue wall swing vote constituencies in all of these by-elections, because the right-wing drift of the party has lost them votes. They won votes in the blue wall under David Cameron, who was a more fluffy, even though he was more draconian on economic policy, than Nigel Farage would have been, or Boris Johnson, for that matter. So I don't think that Johnathan Gullis has this right, but it just does tell you exactly where the right wing of the Conservative Party lie, in Nigel Farage's back pocket.
I really do hope that he comes forward and he joins, and I'd be very happy to welcome him.
I mean, it sounds like you think he might make quite a good leader.
Look, I like Nigel a lot, and of course, if he wants to become leader of the Conservative Party, he's got a long way to go. Got to become a member, got to find a constituency, run to be elected. He's then got to get through the first round of electorate, which is the party MPs, and then he's got to win the membership. Although I think that would probably be an easier one than the MPs round, personally. But I've certainly got no gripes about Nigel, as I say, joining the Conservative Party. But I also respect the fact that we've got Rishi Sunak as the leader of our party right now.
Okay. I mean, would you like to see him maybe even not as Prime Minister, but in a couple of other positions there? You mentioned migration, for example. We've seen today with James Cleverly saying he'd be quite happy to see net migration reduced by 300,000. I mean, I think that would still put us at around the 372,000 a year mark. I think it's fair to say that Nigel wouldn't settle for that kind of stuff. How would you feel about that?
Well, look, first of all, I'd be delighted with the fact that James Cleverly has announced the announcements he made today, the New Conservatives, which I co-founded with Danny Kruger and Miriam Cates, but a 12-point plan. Some of those have been adopted.
Well, but Danny Kruger and Miriam Cates are both people who spread the cultural Marxism conspiracy theory. Just worth pointing out that both of those people are absolute demons.
By the government today, so I'm glad to know that we're being listened to in that regard. But of course, we can't allow 300 plus still to be net migration. We do need to actually deliver on the tens of thousands, and maybe, just maybe, the Conservatives put Nigel Farage in the House of Lords, and we've now got Lord Cameron as Foreign Secretary. So I've got no issue with Lord Farage as Home Secretary in the future, or in any other department, if that was an easier way to get him into government quicker, because I think he would take...
Literally, don't get him voted into anywhere. At least David Cameron had been voted in as an MP at one point. Nigel Farage has never been voted in as an MP. He is addicted to losing elections, right? I mean, I guess he technically won in 2015 because all he cared about was pushing David Cameron to accept a Brexit referendum, which he did. So I guess he kind of won without actually winning anything, right? But in terms of being elected as an MP, he's never been elected. Johnathan Gullis is saying here the Tories need to insert him into an undemocratic position in the Lords so that he can decide policy in government as a cabinet minister, having never been elected into any position in the Westminster Parliament ever in his history of continually standing, right? This is how much these people love democracy, by the way.
Nonsense. He would take no prisoners. He would call out the civil service for what they are at times, which are blockers to actual government policy, and make sure that we deliver on the priorities of the British public.
You mentioned that there might be a bit of pushback.
Yeah, delivering on their priorities by putting people into cabinets despite having never been elected.
When it comes to becoming leader of the Conservative Party, mainly from Conservative MPs, why do you think that is?
I think it's fair to say, Patrick, that the One Nation caucus in the Conservative Party is probably the largest caucus within the Conservative Parliamentary Party. And whilst I've got many friends who are very good Conservatives in that area, I do find that they tend to fall into believing that centrism is everything and that centrism is where we should remain. And my big issue with that is that centrism is more about tinkering than actually radical change and radical progress, which is what the British public voted for in 2016 when they voted for Brexit, and what they voted.
Well, no, but in 2019 they voted for Boris Johnson, who has been the most economically centrist Conservative that we've had since, like, Heath.
For under Boris Johnson in 2019 when it came to the levelling up agenda and really bringing about...
I mean, levelling up was, like, radical in comparison to David Cameron-era austerity, which is something that your party also introduced, right? But spending money on public services and on renewing towns because so much money has been pumped into London, that's not radical, that's normal. That's what you should have been doing the entire time and didn't, right? The fact that both parties, both Labour and Conservative, are so far to the right on economic policy that Johnathan Gullis can talk about spending money on making sure our towns don't fall apart, right, by levelling up the north, as if it's radical policy and not just normal stuff that our governments should be committing to doing anyway, shows you how absolutely screwed up our country is. That's not radical policy, that's normal, and it's also the centrism that you say that you don't want, right?
New way forward, investing in our public services, but also giving people tough law and order, tough border control to really demonstrate that Britain is a mighty nation once again. So I think sadly that too many of my colleagues fall into what I call...
How does that demonstrate that Britain is a mighty nation? That's a very weird framing.
Apologetic conservatism, almost feeling that we have to be liked or nice all the time. And ultimately in politics, you have to make tough decisions. You can't always be liked. You won't always make the popular decision, but most of the time you're trying to make the right one. And I think that's what Nigel is unafraid to do.
Do you think Nigel could win you a general election?
They literally have enough money to film him with 2 cameras, right? One on the laptop and then one filming him on his laptop. Yet they couldn't just get a condenser microphone to him and not have potato audio. What are they doing? Who's deciding on like audio fidelity at GB News? What's going on here? Also, more on top of the politics of that. And again, he seems to be thinking that, you know, you can just ignore what's popular to do what you think is right. And I think there's an argument for that, right? Standing by your principles, but you do also have to get them democratically elected. So you have to actually have enough people who want to support that as well.
I think, to be fair, against Sir Keir Starmer, I think that we could win an election with Nigel, with Rishi Sunak, with whoever, because ultimately I think that we've got a Labour Party that's incredibly weak, that has no actual policies. You know, I watched Yvette Cooper today, Patrick, trying to talk tough about immigration, trying to, I suppose, bring her Thatcherite credentials like Sir Keir Starmer did shamelessly at the weekend. But you watch those backbenchers, they were squirming all over the place because they don't want to talk about immigration, because they actually have no issue with it, because they still support free movement, something that Sir Keir Starmer campaigned to bring back as leader of the Labour Party back in 2020. So, you know, at the end of the day, I think we've got a huge opportunity here to pounce on a Labour Party that is still just very much saying we're not the Conservatives, without offering any solutions to the big problems of the day. And effectively, we'll probably find a way of...
I mean, it's incredibly ironic that we're getting better political analysis on Labour's failure to provide something meaningfully different from Johnathan bloody Gullis than we are from actual left liberal commentators who just continually refuse to criticise him and find myriad ways to paper over his continual actual lack of policy. Incredible.
Trying to rejoin the EU through the back door in order to try and window dress and make us believe that they're doing something else. So, you know, I think that, you know, we're in a really good spot against the Labour Party that is very weak, but we just haven't done enough things to convince the British public that we're credible and we're able to deliver. And that is the bone of my frustration right now.
I mean, yeah, it's really difficult for you to be able to convince the British public that you're credible when you've been in government for 14 years and you've not been credible for that entire period, right? You've continually failed investing in public services. You failed at levelling up even when you were running on a platform of doing levelling up. You failed in delivering Brexit because you ran on an oven-ready deal that wasn't oven-ready and had to be renegotiated again. And now you're saying that Brexit is bad because you have this split from Northern Ireland, which is Nigel Farage's official position, who you want to put into the House of Lords anti-democratically to be able to do policy without actually getting elected. But then you're trying to say these men are the people speaking for the people, despite not being elected. Like, none of these positions make any sense, right? Ironically, the only thing that made sense was criticism of Keir Starmer, who seems to also take many different positions on the same issues with regards to immigration and regards to the European Union, when actually the broad consensus on polling on this is that most people want to rejoin, right? So none of this makes any sense. But apparently he wants to make Nigel Farage a lord, which is most of what I took out of this. But again, these are the kind of people who, again, are part of the Conservative Party. They should tell you what the right of the Conservative Party are like. What if you're watching liberals who voted for David Cameron because he was a sensible pair of hands, who think that David Cameron coming back into government through the back door is a return to normalcy and a return to the centre, you haven't got a clue what you're talking about. You're all idiots. There are no good Tories. They're all the same. And that's exactly what you're looking at right here. Hey there, if you enjoyed the video, make sure that you like and leave a comment. That helps the video out in the algorithm. If you subscribe and ring the bell, it'll let you know when I go live. I stream every day on YouTube and Twitch. You can also follow all of my socials down in the description. And if you want to support me in a more financial manner, there's a join button for membership to just 99p to be a member on YouTube, as well as a Patreon, and there's some merch there as well. And hopefully I'll catch you on the next video. Take care.